Hey guys, it's Ryan, and just Ryan, coming to you from El Salvador. I hope you're doing well out there. World's a bit crazy right now. Things are upside down, to say the least. And one of the ways they are literally upside down is that a place like El Salvador is now receiving people from developed countries instead of losing its people to those countries. At the same time, Salvadorans are coming home in huge numbers. And each one of those people has their own story, their own reasons, their own motivation for making that decision to wrap up their lives in what was formerly a very comfortable country and a comfortable life, to move to El Salvador in search of something better. Our story, the circumstances that led up to our arrival here, was recently published over on escapetoelsalvador.org, and it's an article that you can read, but I thought, hey, you know what, why not share it with you here in this format? So if you'll join me, I've put this together for you. This is the story of Ryan and Jessica leaving Canada and coming to El Salvador. On the 16th of September 1620, the Mayflower set sail due west with its 102 passengers and 30 crew. Branded illegal radicals by the Church of England, the Pilgrims sacrificed everything familiar at the altar of one uncompromising ideal: the freedom to live their lives and practice their faith as they see fit. Without this freedom to chart their own destinies and to exercise their own moral conscience, the Pilgrims believed all else was meaningless. At the time, the bravery of the Pilgrims went largely unnoticed. The old world was much too preoccupied with the roiling political, legal, and military skirmishes which defined the era. While kings and bishops dominated and plundered ordinary folks by way of arbitrary decree, a quiet exodus was underway. On the 18th of February 2022, the Prime Minister of Canada invoked Canada's Emergencies Act in response to the largest grassroots protest movement in Canadian history. The act was penned in 1988 to equip Canada's federal government with the tools to swiftly confront existential threats to the nation. In this first and only instance, the existential threat to Canada was its own working class. Its invocation conferred upon one man, Justin Trudeau, the power to order violent crackdowns, arbitrary detention, and, most shockingly, the confiscation and freezing of bank accounts, all of which was gleefully carried out by every financial institution in the land, and in cooperation with the RCMP, Canada's federal police force. These measures, the Prime Minister assured, would only be used against a small fringe minority of people with unacceptable views. The CBC, Canada's state-run broadcaster, intimated thereafter that such individuals had ties to the Kremlin or belonged to a fascist undercurrent plaguing Canada's brave march forward, thus assuaging the public's concerns about these folks' charter rights. Those concerns, while present, were largely muted. A substantial proportion of Canada's population quietly smirked, while anti-mandate, as distinct from anti-vaccine, protesters were trampled under the hooves of federal horses.
Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness! Look what you did! Look what you did to her!
Those appalled by it were often too frightened to speak up for fear of becoming unemployed, alienated from their friends and family, or worse, under those hooves themselves. Canada, you see, has undergone not just a political change, but a much deeper and more insidious cultural change as well. Less than 24 hours after the act was invoked, this author woke up on another cold and drizzly Atlantic Canadian morning to discover that access to his family's bank accounts had been blocked. Despite being 1,500 kilometers, that's 930 miles, away from the protest zone, we found ourselves suddenly unbanked. We could not buy groceries, put fuel in our car, pay our phone bill, or indeed participate in Canadian society in any manner whatsoever. In effect, we had become exiles in our own homes. By one man's arbitrary decree, a working-class Canadian family had been shut out of society. We wondered, how long will the few supplies we have left last? What happens when they run out? Exactly 1 year earlier, long before anyone but the most paranoid conspiracy theorists ever imagined such events unfolding in Canada, my then fiancé initiated a discussion that would furnish an answer to that terrifying question. It began with just 3 words. What about Bitcoin? Neither she or I knew it at the time, but this simple question would eventually heave us aboard a 21st century version of the Mayflower, embedded in a community of modern-day pilgrims fed up with the excesses and abuses of their governments. In that first discussion, we perceived Bitcoin as a means to protect our savings, which had become threatened by an inflationary surge that was brewing on the horizon. Toward the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, when anxieties were at their peak and the long-term consequences of monetary policy were of little importance to anyone, the federal government had decreed that every Canadian individual barred from their jobs by a nationwide lockdown would receive direct payments to the tune of $2,000 per month. The Bank of Canada, Canada's ostensibly independent central bank, dutifully kicked its money printers into overdrive to fulfill the government's order. During a time when Canada's economic output was in free fall, the quantity of money in circulation would soar. Inflation was the inevitable consequence, and we sought refuge from it in Bitcoin. Milton Friedman said, "Inflation is always and everywhere
a monetary phenomenon. It's always and everywhere a result of too much money, of a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than an output. Moreover, in the modern era, the important next step is to recognize that today governments control the quantity of money."
Unlike national currencies, which are controlled by national governments, the supply of Bitcoin belongs to no jurisdiction. It cannot be controlled by anyone, not even its mysterious inventor, Satoshi Nakamoto. Bitcoin's money supply is programmatically determined and capped at 21 million. As the supply of dollars, euros, pounds, and yen expands all over the world, more and more units of national currency are chasing after a predictable number of Bitcoin, qualifying it as an ideal hedge against fast approaching inflation, despite the volatility of a market that has yet to define it, much less understand it. In February 2021, we began converting our savings into Bitcoin. Our aim was to insulate ourselves against deranged monetary policy, but in February 2022, it would become the vessel that carried us from a deranged political and moral philosophy. Our checking account had been blocked. Our savings account was out of reach. Our next paychecks were, in effect, canceled. Indeed, we had been canceled. Our Bitcoin, on the other hand, remained accessible with just a few clicks of a mouse. National currencies are usable only with the permission of national governments. Despite the inherent insecurity that fact necessarily entails, it's not until that permission is revoked that the intolerably precarious nature of ordinary economic life is truly felt. Bitcoin, in contrast, cannot be confiscated. It cannot be frozen, and its use cannot be censored. It is open to everyone, regardless of race, gender, net worth, religious belief, or political persuasion. No one can deny you permission to use your Bitcoin. Bitcoin is permissionless. What was once a strategic hedge against inflation had suddenly become our only economic instrument. But there was a problem. In Canada, you can't buy your groceries with Bitcoin, nor can you fuel your car or top up your phone plan. Bitcoin is not legal tender in Canada, so it cannot be used to settle any debts. Without a means to convert our Bitcoin to Canadian dollars, merely owning it solved none of our problems. We were simply waiting for the Canadian dollar to collapse. There is one intrepid country in Central America where the opposite is true, however. Just 5 months earlier, in a move that would send El Salvador in the opposite economic and social direction as Canada, a law proposed by President Nayib Bukele was passed by the country's National Congress. An excerpt from that law reads, "The purpose of this law is to regulate Bitcoin as an unrestricted legal tender with liberating power, unlimited in any transaction and to any title that public or private, natural or legal persons require carrying out." This tiny country on the Central American isthmus, which neither me or my wife had committed any thought to before, had suddenly become our Plymouth Rock. In July of 2022, just 1 week after our wedding, we boarded a plane due south. We arrived on the spectacular shores of El Salvador, bewildered and alone, having sacrificed everything familiar in pursuit of economic freedom and freedom of conscience, two precepts which are, in the end, one and the same. Is there a better way to start a marriage? Apart from El Salvador's stunning natural beauty and the overwhelming kindness and generosity of its people, perhaps the biggest revelation of our first days in El Salvador was the sheer number of people who had already arrived, driven by motivations identical to our own. Individuals and families from America, Australia, and this is just who we've met, Britain, Canada, Denmark, Germany, Italy, Mexico, Netherlands, Vietnam, Venezuela, and so many other places were already here. What's more is that within days of our own arrival, we found ourselves greeting even more expatriates coming in behind us, including Salvadorans who left 30, 40 years ago and were now returning home. It quickly became clear that our own voyage to El Salvador was just a small part of a quiet exodus, a global exodus that is taking place while the rest of the world is preoccupied with the political, legal, cultural, and military skirmishes which have defined the early 21st century. Far from being tired and poor, however, and far from being huddled masses, this group of pioneers has landed on the shores of El Salvador with a host of skills and innovative ideas which, after mixing with a local population recently liberated from the clutches of gang rule, have ignited a wildfire of economic and social development across the country. El Salvador, once among the poorest nations on earth, is one of the few economies in the world posting consecutive quarters of double-digit GDP growth. And the atmosphere here in El Salvador is electric. There is an optimism in the air, and the current generation sees prosperity and success for the next. El Salvador has found its identity. Now, this is in stark contrast to our home country of Canada, where even the idea of a national identity has become unfashionable, and where a recent Angus Reid poll found a heavy weight of pessimism pressing down on the optimism that was recently characteristic of the country. Now, our daily life in El Salvador is still sustained by earning a living with a daily grind, but it has become characterized by building a future as opposed to struggling to maintain a mere subsistence. This simple yet powerful change has precipitated improvements in our health. Stress-related illnesses that we had developed in Canada have begun to let go. Chronic aches and pains have subsided. No longer just alive, we are living. So, if you've chosen to listen to this and watch this video in its entirety, no doubt you are someone contemplating a change. Perhaps your country has branded you an illegal radical, or perhaps you've been jolted into the realization that your funds are not your own and that your access to them is entrusted to untrustworthy people. If that's you, you're not alone, and so I implore you, come get acquainted with the bright, beautiful, and growing community of freedom-loving folks here in El Salvador. Whether you're here for an exploratory visit or you make the blind leap, as my wife and I did, your mere presence here creates so many opportunities for others and opens up the same to you. If we can do it, so can you. President Nayib Bukele said, "The plan is simple. While the world falls into tyranny, we will create a refuge for freedom." So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the story. It's not the full story, but it's a good summary of what took place leading up to our departure from Canada and ultimately our arrival in El Salvador. There is lots more to tell. But I want to know what you think. How are you doing where you are? If you're in Canada, if you're in the UK, if you're in the USA, how are you feeling about your situation? Have you thought about making a change? Are you wondering about the security of your savings? If so, we want to hear about it. Head on down below to the comments, send us a DM on Twitter, send us an email. And of course, if you like the content and you want to have more of it, hit that subscribe button and hit that notification bell to never miss another upload. So, once again, thank you for being here, and we'll see you soon. Bye.